And I want to thank each of you for coming tonight. This is it's a neat event. It's a wonderful event to get a more casual, informal discussion with the authors and an opportunity to really appreciate some of the aspects about their writing. And we appreciate your support very much. To introduce the authors and to moderate the discussion, I'm going to ask Bob Fogarty, who's our leading literary expert, as the editor of the Antioch Review. Bob?
Thank you, Merle. Since this is a group who've paid more, actually, there should be some added value to the fact that you're here. So tomorrow night you'll get a brochure which will outline the program, and my remarks will be in there. So what you're getting is an advance copy of that. It's going to be streamed audio-like, meaning I'm going to speak. And the really effort here is to sort of talk about how we go about, at one level, judging and what we look for in the works that we honor. And I don't know if it'll appear this way in the program, but it's called Style and Substance, which is a rather pedestrian title, but that's the one that I chose. One of my favorite figures in the American peace movement is the eccentric John Jacobus Flournoy, who was a bundle of contradictions. He was a pacifist in an area, Athens, Georgia, where there were few. A champion of unorthodox social views, he favored a system of plural marriage, best described as trigamy. He was quarrelsome and prone to get into fights. He was an ardent pamphleteer for the cause of peace and an advocate for the deaf. He authored a pamphlet, An Earnest Appeal for Peace to All Christians, in 1838, and he attempted to sell it for 10 cents a copy, but was forced to give it away when there was only one taker. He then complained bitterly that his neighbors had, quote, the meanness to accept them. However, he persisted in his efforts to spread the good word and enlighten his neighbors in Athens about the peace movement. Henry David Thoreau was his northern counterpart, a fine stylist and a much beloved figure in Concord, Massachusetts, despite his own eccentricities. He labored primarily for the anti-slavery cause and famously refused to pay his taxes in support of the Mexican War, and struck a balance between style and substance throughout his writing career. It is that balance that the Dayton Literary Peace Prize seeks, and we have found it in past years, and once again in this year's winners and in our Lifetime Achievement Award recipient. We have our preliminary local judges and our national judges to thank for all of that. Our fiction judges, Catherine Vaz and Gordon Lish, and our nonfiction judges, Gerald Early and Cullen Murphy, have given us works of both style and substance. Richard Bosch's Peace is a novel about a platoon of soldiers who make their way up a treacherous and dangerous terrain in Italy in an effort to end a war. Bosch's taut prose and his characters' revelations about their fears put a human face on the statistics of war. The fiction runner-up is a first collection of stories written, Say You Are One of Them, written by an African priest, UN Akpan, as literary reportage of human abuse in several African countries. He too gives us a close-up look at the tragedy of war. E. Benjamin Skinner, in his first book, A Crime So Monstrous, revisits a topic that is, regrettably, alive and well in the modern world, namely that of slavery. What William Wilberforce, Frederick Douglass, and Sojourner Truth worked against in the mid-19th century still persists in our age, despite startling advances in science and technology. His account of labor trafficking, forced domestic servitude, and debt bondage took our first prize. Thomas Friedman's Hot, Flat, and Crowded is a clarion call for action against the current global environmental crisis, and it took the runner-up spot in a crowded field of excellent books. We have a distinguished list of writers here this evening as we come together to celebrate both their style and their substantive work. I'd like to begin by just simply asking each one of the authors if they could simply begin to talk about the genesis of the book, namely, where did it come from? What was the gestation period? Where do they think it will go? They hope not to the remaindered shelf, but that's a publishing problem. Richard?
I'm going to begin by telling you a story. There was a woman journalist who was in a hotel overlooking the Wailing Wall. And she saw a little man there praying one morning, and then she looked again in the afternoon, and there he was. And she looked that night, and there he was again. And so she looked the next morning, and there he was. So she started watching. And every day, all day, he was there for 2 weeks. So she decided, this is the story. So she went down and said to him, "Excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt. What are you doing?" He said, "I'm praying." And she says, "What are you praying for?" He says, "World peace. In the morning, I come pray for world peace. Then I go have some lunch, I come back. And I pray for world peace. And then I go have dinner, some soup, and I come back. And I pray into the night for world peace." And she said, "That's amazing. And you've been doing it for 2 weeks." He says, "I've been doing it for 30 years. He says, "Gosh, how does it make you feel?" He says, "Feels like I'm talking to a goddamn wall." Sometimes I think that peace exists only where we are not. And I think that there is something, not to sound pompous, essentially at war in the human soul that's been going on since we've been around. But I still think that the little man is right, to keep praying for it and keep trying for it. There's another thing that one of our great poets, Robert Frost, said of the truth, that if you just keep saying it patiently and calmly, eventually people will hear it. That you have to trust that. And so for me, I didn't have any of these thoughts in mind when I started writing that book, but I knew immediately I would call it Peace. Because I knew that essentially what it was going to be about, even in the fog of war, was peace, was the hope for it. And also that the book would be an exploration of what I really felt as writing it. It's a story I'd known for a long, long time. My father told me a version of this story that happened to him, where he was asked to shoot an old Italian peasant who was also Catholic. And my father was a devout Catholic, and he took him off in the woods and let him go. That's the bones of what became this novel. I knew that what would happen to these men, I knew it the way an animal knows smelling blood. That the closer they got to the actual burning center of violence, the less human they would be. That my central character's ability even to remember the face of his own wife or what his child's name was is obliterated by the things he has to do. And he has to do them to survive. And that was a discovery I made writing the book, that there is something about violence that kills something inside even the person practicing it. And that it is it's the great tragedy of human experience, human life, that we have this miraculous ability to cooperate and to be brotherly and sisterly and to help each other. And we get to where we're helping each other kill. And every war takes place, every army is a group of human beings with this tremendous ability to cooperate and to work together. And the end they're working for is always an abstraction of one kind or another. And the result, of course, is all of the history, the terrible history that we all know. And of course, the fiction writer's job is, in my view, is not to posit an answer, but just to show the truth of it as he sees it. So that's what I tried to do with that novel as I was doing it. I was thinking about those men in that circumstance and what would And then I became, and this is the last thing I'll say because I don't want to go on too long, but I discovered that thinking about it, and then I looked into it to see, most of the average American soldiers did not know what was happening on the other side. They had no idea of the camps and the systematic slaughter. And I realized that one of the things that would happen in this novel would be that they would be confronted with this horror and have to realize what was happening. That it would change them when they realized it, and all their petty hatreds would fall away in the face of it. And that's what you write for. You write for those discoveries where you find out something you never know you knew. So I love teaching it. It's wonderful to teach it, fiction writing. That's all I'll say.
The genesis, actually, before I get to the genesis of the book, I have to take advantage of the fact that we have everybody concentrated here who's been so supportive of this prize. And I have to say thank you very much. And I know I speak for Richard and the other honorees. For me in particular, this is a game changer. I've won one Peace Prize before. I was in 3rd grade. And my teacher gave me a prize that said Peace Prize for being a peace person, for being nice to everybody. And that was she sent me an email after the notice of this came out in the local paper. This is certainly my first literary prize. I have to speak on behalf of, I'm going to take the liberty and speak on behalf of Thomas Friedman as well, to say thank you. He's languished in anonymity for very long. Even though he wasn't the winner this time, I know he appreciates the recognition. The genesis of my book was, in a sense, I have abolition and abolitionism in my blood. My family in this country goes back to the Mayflower, and my ancestors were Quaker ministers back in the days when Quakers had ministers, and they would go around and stand on their soapboxes and rail against the traffic in men body. And my great uncle was a comb maker in Connecticut, and he was told that his abolitionist talk was suppressing sales in the South, and he said, if they won't buy my Yankee combs, let them go lousy. And this was lore, this is what I grew up with. My mother always pressed me to do something beyond, outside of myself. In her yearbook, where everybody else had career aspiration to be a doctor, to be a lawyer, she had conscientious citizen of the world. You put all that together, you grow up in Madison, Wisconsin, and no matter what profession you choose, I mean, I could have been a plastic surgeon, and I probably would have found some way to try to feel redemptive about it. So I chose the profession of my grandfather, who was a small town newspaper editor in Meriden, Connecticut for 50 years. He was the editor of the Meriden Record Journal. And I began looking around for stories, and I became very attracted to the idea of writing about modern day slavery. And the reason was I picked up a book, a very good, earnest, and somewhat dry academic study called Disposable People by Kevin Bales, an excellent book. And he put an estimate of the total number of slaves in the world at 27 million. That's the high-end estimate. It's been adopted by most UN agencies. The International Labor Office actually has the number at 12.3 million. One way or another, it's more slaves today than at any point in human history. And so what I wanted to do, and I felt this this calling, both from my folks and from Quaker Meeting, where I went to Sunday school and we learned more about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman as we would about Jesus and Moses. I wanted to go and put a human face on those statistics because as Stalin, unfortunately it's terrible when you're quoting Stalin just like that. You have to qualify. Sometimes it's the worst people that have the best quotes, and Joseph Stalin is supposed to have said, and of course he knew something about mass killing, the death of 1 million men is a statistic, the death of one man is a tragedy. And I wanted to get beyond the statistics and get to what slavery really meant for the men, for the women, for the children that are living it. So again, I want to thank you. The prize for me is a game changer, not just from a professional sense. I'll get more into this tomorrow, but from a real sense of impacting lives, it has changed the lives of hundreds. So thank you.
Well, I'm Taylor Branch, and I'm not a winner this year. I'm a winner from last year, here to present the Lifetime Achievement Award to Nick Kristoff and Cheryl Wu Dung. And I'm honored to do that for their work about lifelong and famous work about the exploitation of women around the world. The oddity, though, is I want to thank everybody from last year because my mother had such a great time here. Everybody's been asking me how my mom is and where is she. She seemed to have bonded with about half the people here. She's home in Atlanta. And did I lose this?
Try that one.
She's home in Atlanta. Couldn't come. The other oddity, though, I will speak about the work of Nick and Cheryl tomorrow. It is a true honor to the prize. It's a vital subject. But the other oddity is the coincidence. I'm here in part for my current book, which has nothing to do with the literary prize, except that it's a diary that I kept with Bill Clinton that includes his talk about the Dayton Accords to end the war in Bosnia. And it was a very, very odd, and I'll just mention this because it won't be part of tomorrow. Tomorrow is all about the winners this year and the work of Nick and Cheryl when they get here. But I've been working for 24 years doing Martin Luther King, the work for which you so graciously honored me last year. And in the middle of that, something came to me from the deep past that when I was a 25-year-old, I was sent to Texas with a fellow 25-year-old, Bill Clinton, to run the McGovern campaign. He brought his new girlfriend, Hillary. We got an apartment together. We got clobbered by Richard Nixon in the 1972 election. People ask me since, did I know that my old buddy was destined to be president? I say, are you kidding? We lost Texas by 30 points. We didn't think we were going to be dog catchers. But we left in some disagreement at the time that he was going to go run for Congress in Arkansas at 25. Hillary and I were more like our generation, being very disillusioned with politics. All three of us got involved in politics from non-political families because of the steady witness of the civil rights era, especially Bill and me down in growing up in the South. And here, all of that promise seemed to be so damaged by politics full of riots and discord, and by a war in Vietnam that the people had voted against twice and then now ratified after it had killed 1 million Vietnamese and over 50,000 Americans, and we had lost this election. And I said to Bill, you and I have spent this enormously significant election refereeing the pettiest of disputes between Texas politicians over who sits where on the dais. and who rides where in the motorcade. And that's what the politicians care about. And I've had it with politics. I'm going into writing. There's more integrity there. And he said to me, as he famously remembered, and I remembered the exact same words 25, 30 years later, his reply was, Taylor, if you want to solve problems in the world, you got to build up your capacity and your patience for squabbles over who rides where in the motorcade. Because that's where everything starts, and you've got to work through human nature to solve anything and not go around human nature like you writers. which I thought was uncalled for. I hadn't thought of writing a book at that time, and what he was essentially saying is that writers distance themselves from the inconvenient parts of human nature and have these highly moral poses that look good but don't get anything done. We were estranged for 20 years. I did not speak to him. The next time I saw him, he was President-elect of the United States. He summoned me for a dinner and said, surrounded by Secret Service agents, he's President-elect, and he looks at me and he's posted 2 Secret Service agents to hold back a wall of famous people trying to get to him. And said, I've only got a second. Taylor, first of all, can you believe all this? Instantly looking at the world through my point of view, that this was like Rip Van Winkle, that my old buddy from Texas is now president. And then he said, I read Parting the Waters and your King stuff. I read the reference notes. They're from presidential libraries. I want my records to be that vivid so that people 50 years from now can figure out whatever I do. I don't give a damn what it is, but I want them to know what it is. And he said, can you help me with that? And out of this came, eventually, after lots of negotiation, the notion of keeping a secret oral history in the White House for all 8 years of his presidency, in which I would record what he wanted to put on the record late at night. While I was writing the Martin Luther King thing by day, every now and then I'd get a call to come down and bring my recorders that I used to do all my civil rights interviews and my little notes of what had happened since then, and go into the residence. He not into the Oval Office or into the West Wing, but away from the staff, up in the private quarters, and we would record from 11 o'clock to 1 in the morning. And I would drive home stupefied by what it was like to sit and talk with the sitting President of the United States about what was going on. But his motive was that we have lost the reality and the balance between political dialogue and the human beings that run our government, and that we have kind of a spitball, atrophied political discourse, and that if the American people had a better sense of their history and these people, we would have better outcomes in our politics. Nobody since Nixon has recorded phone conversations for obvious reasons. Records are not very, very well kept, so that our dialogue about presidents is largely on the basis of ideological cartoons. And he wanted to try to do something different. The result is a very eccentric memoir. It was his idea that I do this memoir. And he said, nobody's ever done anything like this with a sitting president, to record what the president feared would be lost with his memory if he died otherwise, and to record what it was like to be there, gathering it in the maelstrom of what goes on in the White House, with Hillary coming in to say goodnight and Chelsea coming in to ask for help with her homework. And Hillary came in one night and said she just had a dream about Henry Kissinger and could I help her interpret it while the president went off. These and 1,000 other things make this a very eccentric book that I hope one day will restore some sort of sense of balance, or at least help. The only thing I want to say about the substance of the book is about Bosnia. There's a lot about it. It goes all the way through the night of the Dayton Accord. I was there the night before the Dayton Accords were signed, and we had a session that went over till 2 o'clock in the morning, and he thought it was going to end in failure. He said, Chris, go ahead and break it off. If they won't make the peace, you can't make them make it. I'll back you up. He also said, if this peace fails, I will have to, and Chris, should warn him that I will one day tell the world that Izetbegovic of Bosnia was the one who ultimately was the last obstacle to the peace to save his nation. And there are lots of other details in there, but at our very first session, he told me, this is in 1993, he said, Taylor, Bosnia is difficult, and let me put down the record, and he did this long talk. He said, the same European leaders who are saying that this is a great genocide and a tragedy and we need to solve it in public are saying in private that no Muslim nation belongs in Christian Europe and this problem will take care of itself over time if we just let it go away. He said, this is a much, much rougher quest for peace. It's not that different from the diplomacy, from the skullduggery diplomacy about the plight of fleeing Jews during World War II, and that nations, including ours, would turn a blind eye. And we're not that far from it. And to get from there to peace is a long way. So the reality of some of these things is raw. The fact that you're trying to honor the Dayton Peace Accord, more power to you, in some respects is more difficult, because the reputation of peacemaking and the difficulty of peacemaking is diminished in our time because we don't have the respect for what politics at its best can accomplish, that it's the result of very difficult thought. All these problems are intellectually challenging, politically challenging, personally challenging. To stand for peace is hard. So I salute you for doing that. All the more from something that I couldn't talk about before, which is the work with this president talking about how to create the Dayton Accord in the first place. So more power to you. Thanks.
I'm going to take, I think it's Stalin who said, I wrote this down, compassion is a sickness that afflicts dogs. What I'm going to do is ask a follow-up question, and then we'll open it up for comments and questions from the audience. Could you sort of indicate what have been the most gratifying and perplexing reactions to your work?
Starting with me?
Sure.
There was a review in the Houston Chronicle, 2 words, my first novel, Bah Humbug. That was a little troubling. There's an amazing story about Stalin, by the way. He came into a room and there were 24 men around the table, and they all stood up to applaud, and they were applauding Stalin, and he was looking down the table and around the table, up and down. They kept applauding, and suddenly it became a thing. Who was going to stop applauding first? And they kept applauding, and it went on, and it went on. It went on for almost an hour, and they were standing there. And finally, one fellow thought, well, this is ridiculous. He stopped, hitched his pants up, and sat down and spent 10 years in the gulag. So he was a prince of a guy. I think the most perplexing, I don't read my own reviews. This is nothing about integrity. It has to do with mortal fear. I can be very easily derailed. I come from that school of fiction writers that is always willing to believe the last negative thing one heard, or even the last negative inference. I had a woman come up to me at a party and say, I like parts that take me back so much. It was my second novel. I couldn't help it. I said, I like parts of your face. Don't say that stuff to me. To me, the real perplexing thing with anything that you do is, I think, just the fact that, for me, it's always the book is done and it's going to have whatever fate it will have. You hope it will have readers. And by the time you're as old as I am doing it, it will have a certain number of readers, and it'll stop there, and it'll disappear like everything else. And and I don't mean that in a negative, complaining way. It's just the way of the world. You work in the perfect understanding that the world will mostly ignore what it is that you've done. You have to accept that as part of your destiny. You do this thing, it's a gift. and you practice it as well as you can, and the world will do what it wants with it. For me, the perplexing thing sometimes is when things happen that I don't expect to happen that are sort of beyond the pale of being good, like a big prize. I mean, it's kind of hard to, I can't explain it, but it makes you feel strange. I don't mean this is a negative thing or a complaint, but it does make you feel strange because it's a book and you wrote it and it's passed and it's done and you're working on something else. And so I think that's all I can think of to say about that particularly.
I think for me, also the most surprising reaction has been winning a prize. I turned 33 years old in May, and I spent the most of my 20s trying to get any editor to pick up the phone, and more recently, this has certainly helped access in terms of getting published. But in terms of the substance of the book, I'll talk about, just in the interest of brevity, two reactions to my decision in one particular instance in the book. As part of this, I wanted to go and talk to traffickers, people that buy and sell human beings. And to do that, I would, at various points, pose as somebody who was interested in buying and selling human beings. And it was a long process of talking to my editor and talking to sort of my ethical guideposts, principally my mother, who, no matter who my other ethical guideposts are, she winds up being the one that I go to, about whether it's right to pay for human life, and I ultimately determined that it was not. The overwhelming decision, the overwhelming advice came from those that work diligently to actually free human beings and to keep them free and to rehabilitate them. Those that run shelters, those that run anti-trafficking organizations that conduct raids and then work to keep the liberated free and away from traffickers. And they said overwhelmingly, do not pay for human life, you will be giving rise to a trade in human misery. And that's a very easy thing to understand, that phrase, that motto, that mantra. It's a more difficult thing when you're in an underground brothel near the rail terminus in Bucharest, and you are offered, as I was, a young woman with a visible affective Down syndrome with slashes all over one of her arm, where she's been trying to escape daily rape the only way that she knows how. And this young woman is offered to me in exchange for a used car. And you go into this negotiation and you record the negotiation wearing a wire under your shirt, and then you walk away. And the only thing that you do is you take this wire to the police and say, this is all the evidence you need, I'm willing to testify, and then you get the sense, and I followed up a year later, that they did not do a damn thing. I told that story on NPR the day that the book came out, and I got two reactions. In answer to your question, I got two reactions. And then I took my email off my website because it was too intense. One of the reactions was from somebody saying, how could you, I hope you burn in hell. And I explained, and I said, this was maybe my naivete. I said, if you'll just look at the free chapter that Simon & Schuster has published online, that explains why I decided not to pay for human life. And they said, the response was, well, here you are, and you're trying to hawk your book, and you're not going to get a penny out of us. I go back to my original statement that I hope you burn in hell. And the second reaction was a much more deeply touching one for me. It was a woman from North Carolina who emailed me, and she said, I don't I don't know what I can do, and I don't have very much money, but I will give everything that I have. I just need to know that that girl is safe. I will do anything that I can to get that girl safe. And the reason why I care about this so much, and she emailed a picture of her 3-year-old son who had Down syndrome. And she said, you know, this is my Jack, and this is why I care so deeply about this. And I think it was a solemn reminder for me. The model for my book was my friend Samantha Power's book on genocide, A Problem from Hell, a magnificent book that where she described a tremendous human problem and did so with a certain degree of a great degree of sensitivity, but also a certain degree of detachment. She got into the details. She talked about the policymakers. The difference I realized when I was in that Bucharest brothel and when I got that email, and I've realized throughout the book, is that the people that Samantha was writing about are the victims that she was describing are dead, and the victims that I'm describing are very much still alive, and that's why my commitment to them continues today.
My reactions. My book's only been out a month, and the reactions vary all over the lot. Other than the Clintons themselves, the signal reactions for me have been, first, Christopher Hitchens on the positive side, someone who loathed Clinton with all the scornful eloquence he inherited from Richard Burton, saying that this book had made him whistle more than any other book in a realization that perhaps he had lived in a different reality. So that was nice from Christopher. More typically on the other side from Campbell Brown on CNN, opening remarks of an interview. Taylor, I'm sure it will not surprise you that I went straight to the index for one name, Monica Lewinsky. Can you tell me what's new about Monica in your book? Lots of those. And more personally, again, from our daughter and son, Franklin and Macy, who said, Dad, our friends would feel a lot better about you if you could just get on Jon Stewart. Why can't you get on?
Are there any questions, comments from the audience?
I have a question for Benjamin. I'm in the process of reading your book. And
Thank you.
First of all, my name is Faraha, and I teach at St. Clair Community College. So I had it in my mind, grab the books and I'm going to read them right before I meet you. But your book is not one that I can read quickly. I have to stop, digest. I shared a portion of it with my students, and one of the questions that they asked me to ask you is, who did you, when you were writing the book, who were you writing for? Because many of them are students who, they don't read books unless it's assigned for class. They're rather watch TMZ or some other gossip show, but it really affected them. And I'm wondering, did you have just an everyday average person in mind at all when you were writing this, or who were you writing for?
Thank you very much for picking up the book and for passing it on to your students in particular. One of the feelings that and beliefs that I've come to hold is that modern day slavery will only end in 25 years, which is I believe the time frame that it would actually take a generation, if our generation owns this. And so it means a lot to me that you would do that. In terms of who I wrote the book for, I probably shouldn't admit this on a day that I'm receiving a literary prize, but I'm not a big reader. I'm part of the MTV generation. I grew up I grew up with MTV News as one of my major sources of news. I worked for somebody who sort of beat that out of me after college, but and who forced me to read a little of the sort of canon of Western literature, which I hadn't read up till that point. I was writing for people in my generation who, as you say, have a shorter attention span, but are no less intelligent and no less committed once they get moved to do something about this. I was speaking yesterday to a rival high school, to my high school in Madison, Wisconsin, and there are about 1,000 kids there. I was the keynote for their Human Rights Week, and afterwards I had about 36 kids who skipped their next class, even though they should have been going to it, and came up to me and said, your book moved me a tremendous amount. It made me want to be a journalist, which I found as high praise as I can get. And I didn't want to dissuade them. I said, expect a lot of rejection, expect no pay. Journalists at the moment in this country, I think, are ranked somewhere above, somewhere between politicians, and I think actually politicians were ranked higher. I'm not sure about that in terms of their public reputation. But it was so moving to me that kids from my generation who I presume are like me, derive most of their information increasingly now from the internet and from Twitter feeds and things like this. I was on stage recently with Ashton Kutcher, and apparently his Twitter reaches more than CNN at the moment, which tells you something about but he's interested in modern day slavery, and so I was writing with that generation in mind, and if I write for the I used to work very briefly. I was honored to work for David Halberstam, and I love his work. But if I write exclusively 800-page books that reach people that have a great deal of interest in the Korean War or the works of David Halberstam, I'm not going to be reaching a new generation, and I recognize that. And this issue is way too important to consign to a narrow group like that.
Others in the back. Sharon.
I've been recently made aware that Ohio does not stand well on the issue of modern day slavery, that we do indeed have slavery in our own state. Can you address that, please?
Sure.
And you're putting me on the spot. The FBI has done, and the Justice Department has an excellent, very small civil rights division that has prosecuted cases in Ohio and other states. Not to the degree that they, the cases that have been prosecuted and adjudicated are a fraction of those that are estimated to exist. In Ohio and across the country, there are estimated to be, this is the Justice Department estimate, between 14,000 and 17,000 trafficked into slavery every year. Put another way, we've been up here talking for about half an hour, 45 minutes, and on average in that half an hour, one more person will have become a slave on U.S. soil. And you think about the dedication of our ancestors in this country to fight this, and you think about the fact that my ancestors that weren't Quakers, they were all pretty bellicose folks, but the Quakers were pacifists. My great-great-grandfather wasn't a Quaker. He wasn't a pacifist, and he fought with Grant's army at the siege of Petersburg. 360,000 of his comrades died to enshrine the Emancipation Proclamation of the 13th Amendment, and yet Today, there are more people trafficked into slavery on U.S. soil than there were in colonial America. Now, it's obviously less than the height of the slave trade into America, but that shouldn't assuage our conscience. 14,000 to 17,000, 1,400 to 1,700, 1,000 to 4,000. One slave is too many, and there is slavery very, very close to where we are. I've talked to a survivor who was trafficked and held for years in Ohio. Actually, she's now living in Ohio. I believe she was trafficked in Michigan originally. But the fact is, this is not far from where we live.
One final question from someone? Anyone? Urging people to, yes, Deborah.
A question for Richard. When I was reading your novel, I thought it was very interesting that your character's family was from Piqua. So I wonder now if your father was from Piqua, if you have Ohio ties.
My father was born in Piqua, and he called it Pickway. That's the way I grew up hearing it, until he was 17. And then his father moved the family to Washington, D.C. When he was 17 years old because of the Depression. He got a job at the Navy Yard, where he worked until he retired. Now, I was born in Georgia, and I've never seen Piqua. I was in Dayton in 1967 with a rock band. We were actually playing in Xenia, Ohio, and we pulled in from Alabama after a week in Alabama. And we had been driving all night, and I had the great idea. I said, look, we can't go to sleep because we had set up, we had 2 hours, it was actually 3 hours before we were supposed to play. And I said, if we go to sleep, we're going to be terrible. Let's do something. Let's go into Dayton and look around. And we walked into a theater, and they were showing, I said, we'll go to a movie and we'll eat popcorn. And we went in, and it was the greatest story ever told. And I don't know if any of you know that movie, but there's a scene when they're giving the silver to Judas. They're counting the silver in his palm, and the director, George Stevenson, counted all 30 coins. And I had this great big Coke in my lap, and I was getting more and more sleepy. And I went to sleep, and it slowly went down and dropped in my lap. And I looked down and started laughing and said, Jesus Christ. And I looked up, and there was Max von Sydow dying on the cross. So I made a lot of enemies in that theater. And that was 38 years ago. Thanks for the question.
Well, if on your visit you should go to Versailles, and you should go to Russia, and you should go to a whole number of other Ohio cities where the towns get mispronounced. I'm sure many of you know that. Well, I'd like to thank all of our authors for their comments.